liturgy of Addai and Mari. These are followers of Christ or disciples. Thaddeus, who founded the original Apostolic Church of the East. 1. Some preliminary marks. 1. Cut. Chapter 4, Liturgy of Addai and Mari. 1. Some preliminary remarks. Cut. Take 2. Chapter 4, Liturgy of Addai and Mari. They're probably the disciples, Thaddeus and Mari. 1. Some preliminary remarks. The main liturgy of the Church of the East is known as the Liturgy of Addai and Mari. In addition to this ancient liturgy, 2 other liturgies are also used, i.e. Liturgy of Theodore of Mopsuestia and the Liturgy of Nestorius. Addai and Mari is used on all days, except the Sundays between the Advent and Summer Sunday, when Theodore is used, and special 5 days, Epiphany, John the Baptist Day, Memorial of Greek Doctors, Wednesday of the Fast of the Ninevites, and Maundy Thursday, when Nestorius is used. Our main discussion for the purpose of the following is limited to the first one. It is usually referred to as the Nestorian liturgy. It is earlier than the other 2 and more complete, while Theodore and Nestorius are anaphora only. Moreover, it is often used and represents the Syriac tradition, while the other 2 are believed to have been brought from Constantinople and translated from Greek into Syriac in the 6th century in honour of their heroes, i.e. Theodore of Mopsuestia and Nestorius. It has been argued by the majority of the Western scholars that these 2 works are not the real works of Nestorius or Theodore. The Nestorians, however, do not agree with this opinion. Among the Roman Catholic Christians, 2 Uniate rites use this liturgy, of course, in a revised or a reformed form. The Chaldeans of the Middle East and the Syro-Malabar Rite in India were Nestorians. Both these groups brought about changes in order to purge the liturgy from the charge of Nestorian heresy. Fortescue, an English Catholic historian, justifies these changes with an additional charge that the Anglicans have brought about changes in the addition of the Nestorian liturgy. He argues they have, quite rightly, tampered with the historic rite on this point, which they think essential, as they have also by leaving out heretical names and clauses. They can hardly then blame Rome for having done the same in the Uniate rites, in cases which we consider essential. Adrian Fortescue, The Lesser Eastern Churches, page 155. The brackets found in this quotation are of Fortescue himself. The Chaldeans called the anaphora of Theodore and anaphora of Nestorius the second hallowing and third hallowing, respectively, with the mention of the names of the Greek fathers who they repudiated at the time of their submission to the Pope in 1553 AD. Messenger Duchesnes was wrong when he spoke of Addai and Mari as the only one used by the Chaldean Uniates. This is the source. Unfortunately, another French scholar, Père Séverin Savlaville, makes the same statement. Probably he borrowed this error from Messenger Duchesnes, or Monsignor, that's what that is, Monsignor Duchesne. Regarding the translations of this liturgy, mention must be made of Renaud, who translated into Latin the liturgy of Addai and Mari. This was included in Hammond's liturgies. Later, George Percy Badger, who lived among the Nestorians around Mosul in 1842-43 AD, made an English translation of the Nestorian liturgy and published it in 1875 AD. That translation was also not accurate, as Badger did not have access to the various manuscripts of the liturgy. it's got down here. This is considered to be imperfect by Thoma, Damo Metropolitan, who writes, the translation was an excellent one and much appreciated, but unfortunately it was founded on extremely imperfect manuscripts. Reverend K.A. Paul and Rev. George Mukin printed and published the Liturgy of the Holy Apostles, Addai and Mari, together with the liturgies of Ma Theodorus, Ma Nestorius, and the Order of Baptism. Chukur Ma Nasai Press, 1967, preface, page 3. The translation was also not accurate, as Badger did not have access to the various manuscripts of the liturgy. The English translation published by the SPCK London in 1893 AD, though it has no official approval, should be counted as of considerable value in regard to the sincerity and scholarship, for it has been done by the members of the Assyrian mission of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which it is believed that A.J. MacLean, who translated East Syrian daily offices, was the main translator of this liturgy. In spite of the changes, studies in the Chaldean liturgy and Syro-Malabar liturgy provide much useful information on the Nestorian liturgy. This fact justifies our reason for quoting Catholic scholars like King, Fortescue, etc. It is an unfortunate act, however, that there are no publications written by Nestorian scholars which could have spoken little more authoritatively on the issues concerned. The present writer therefore considered this attempt as humble beginning in order to fill that distinct void in the liturgical literature in the English language. 2. History of the liturgy. The Nestorians survived in isolation from the rest of Christendom since the 5th century and practically remained unknown in the English-speaking world until the beginning of the British and American missions resulted from the sudden rediscovery of the Nestorians by the Western travellers in the first half of the century. This, however, is not true of the liturgy. The very beginning of the study of the liturgiology of the famous, according to the famous Roman Catholic scholar E. Renaud, made this Latin translation of all the 3 forms of liturgy used by the Nestorians. About 10 years later, the famous Syriac scholar J.S. Asimani published his classic Bibliotheca Orientale, in which he tried to show the liturgical usage and Eucharist teachings which differed from the Catholic practice. J.M. Neal, the great Anglican, something Catholic of the last century, who considers the Eucharist teachings of the Nestorians as lamentably low, wrote of this liturgy as one of the earliest and perhaps the very earliest of the many formularies of the Christian sacrifice. Much credit for bringing the Nestorian liturgy to the attention of the English-speaking world goes to George Badger of the Church of England, who visited the Nestorians in 1842 AD. Though the first volume of the Nestorians and their rituals is mainly a travelogue, his second volume gives many liturgical texts in English translations. He preferred to translate the anaphora of Nestorius rather than that of Addai or Mari, for the simple reason that he wanted to prove that even the scroll called Anaphora of Nestorius did not contain the heresy which most of the Anglicans were afraid of. Badger proved the orthodoxy of the teachings of the Nestorians, including the Eucharist, on the basis of the 39 Articles. 2 of the successors of Badger wrote a similar book with a similar view, viz. Of exciting the interest of the Anglicans in order to strengthen the mission of help to the Assyrians, the Catholicus of the East and his people, written by A.J. MacLean and W.H. Brown, therefore is more descriptive rather than a critical exposition of the liturgy and practices of the Nestorians, and so forth. According to Van Uynek, the writings of, I don't know what that says here, J. Lamy, 1859, and Dr. Stites on the Nestorian liturgy did not go beyond the conclusions of Asimani. University W.C. Van Unik, Historian Questions on the Administration of the Eucharist by Isho Yab, 4, page 35 by the look of it. Looks like there's a bit of a squabble there. Looks like it continues. This guy's casting some doubt on whether the historians preserved the original liturgy of Mesopotamia, or he maybe feels they didn't, they couldn't have. Eucharist prayer. The most striking characteristic of the Eucharist prayer is the importance of the second person of the Trinity. It is addressing not to the Father but to the Son. Okay, this guy looks like he's divided that prayer, Eucharist prayer, into 10 parts as follows. There's quite a lot in this book, and it's very, very interesting. The Theology of Consecration. The question may be asked whether the Nestorian liturgy teaches transubstantiation. Like many other Eastern churches, this church too has not defined a doctrine either of transubstantiation or of consubstantiation. The word used for Eucharist is Gurbana, oblation. It is also called Kutasha or Kutasha, which means hallowing. It is considered a rasa or mystery, mostly written in plural form, ras, mysteries. The place of the catechumens. The Church of the East is called the most missionary-minded church until the later part of the Middle Ages, and rightly so. Could be an explanation here. John Stewart gave the title Nestorian Missionary Enterprise to his book on the history of the Church of the East. In the introduction to this book, he speaks of a connected account of the missionary enterprises of this most missionary of all churches, John Stewart, Nestorian Missionary Enterprise, the story of a church on fire. Though the Nestorian church today is a declining church, it used to be a fast-growing church at the time when the liturgy was formed. Hence, there is a provision for the catechumens to attend the first part of the liturgy, which is mainly instruction. Down here, this was also the practice of the early church, which was a fast-growing community, imparting instruction to the catechumens in the early portion of the liturgy. sermon. It's all summed up. Ground plan of the Nestorian churches. See how they're laid out. Probably main interests here. Wonder if that's seminaries or something else. Or sections, altar veils sections, okay. Maybe. Altar known as in Syriac as Madka. Raised platform called Bema. Baptistry and vestry. Fun for adults, babies. Guess that's where you get baptized. That's separate area. Maybe this is the seating, not too sure. Inside their mess. Outline of the liturgy of Addai and Mari. Breaking of the bread. Theology of the Church. The Church of the East has not defined an ecclesiology as the Western churches have defined. Church is a congregation which Christ built on earth by Holy Spirit. It is described in the Nicene Creed as Catholic, Apostolic, Holy and Holy One. It is called Catholic because Jesus accepted people of all nations into his fold. Catholic just means basically globally or universally. The church is called the Apostolic because Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone of the building. The church is built upon the foundations of the apostles and prophets. The church is holy because all her members are sanctified by holy baptism and Holy Ghost lives in them. The church is called a holy one since it is said that there is one Lord, one faith and one baptism, one God and Father of all who is love, of all who is, who love all and through all and in all of us. The children in Sunday schools of this church proudly recite the answer to the question, then which is the true and only one church? It is as follows. Christmas is on January 7th according to the Julian calendar. January 7th is 25th of the Syriac month called Kanon Kadim. The following dates were, or maybe that's Kanon Kadim. The following dates were collected from the calendars published from the Mar Nasi Press Tricker. The future dates of the Gregorian calendar were supplied by the Roman Catholic Bishop of Tricker. Asterisks are given on the years when Julian calendar coincides with the Gregorian calendar. So using it as a determinator, right? That's what it sounds like. to determine these dates and these events. To clarify those events. Piety, monasticism. The Nestorian Church was famous for its monasteries. Monks were plenty in this church since 4th century. Solomon, the church historian, has mentioned about the monastic movement of this church. Ecclesiastical History 6:34. Fasting and abstinence. Absence of images. The Nestorian churches never had images. The only object of veneration is a bare cross. The crucifix is never used. They believe that the use of the crucifix or pictures of Christ will be breaking the second commandment God has given to Moses. Though Valipali in Tricca does not have any images, like all other Nestorian churches, the act remains that once it contains several images, including a beautiful one of Virgin Mary. It is quite pertinent to ask why the images were kept in the church. The very presence of images in the past in the church is argued even today by Roman Catholics as proof of this church once being a Roman Catholic church. The origin of images in this church is unknown. There is no evidence to show that there were images in this church at the time of its founding in AD 1814. In the absence of any historic proof, a correct date cannot be fixed. It can be reasonably conjectured that some of these images are several decades old. They were in the church possibly even before the time of Rochus and Malchus, the Catholic Chaldean metropolitans who ruled this church in Chicha in the second half of the last century. From the mere existence of images, the doctrine of image worship cannot be attributed to this church, because Archdeacon Thoma, known as Kuruvila Aiken, was preaching against image worship in this church during the period AD 1899 to 1911. Well, we did read that the Church of the East the land was invaded by the then Mohammedans, or Islam, who just basically wanted the land, and says, you'll be safe under the rule of Islam if you keep the peace, don't start any trouble, that sort of stuff. But in your churches you can't have idols or basically idols, so they got rid of all of those and just use icons, possibly images. That's what we read, so not too sure about this one. Okay, here it says no image was allowed in the church, even for a fancy or decoration. Images were removed in 1925. Some of them were burnt. The most beautiful one of Virgin Mary was burnt publicly on a Monday night after the festival of Kadash Aditha in 1951, in a way very offensive and painful for the Roman Catholics. Some are even now kept in a dark room upstairs. These images one day decorated the altar of this church. They were there even in 1925 when not too sure what that word there is. Probably Monsignor C.W. Cotton, the arbitrator of this church, visited Valipali, accompanied by the advocates of both sides in the court cases mentioned earlier. Having seen the images in the altar, Mr. Cotton, who was a Protestant, is reported to have remarked, "It seems to me that this is a Catholic church." Images were also used to be taken out in procession. Therefore, no doubt veneration to images in this church could be argued, but on the other hand, the possibility of keeping the images for decoration and not worshipping then cannot be easily dismissed. The Nestorians feel that it is very important that they should turn to the east while they worship. Marganitha quotes the words of our Lord, "As the lightning cometh forth from the east and shineth towards the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man be." Marganitha states that the custom of worshipping towards the east is the subject of an apostolical canon. The same writer records that paradise is in the east, and man should look toward the old place from which humans were driven out on account of the sins of mankind. The same author argues on the authority of Mar Abram of the 4th century that Gabriel appeared to the Virgin from the east, and the disciples were facing east when the risen Lord ascended up to heaven. Conclusion. In the foregone pages we have seen briefly the introduction to 7 sacraments of the Church of the East. The liturgy of Addai Mari is more significant owing to the interest evinced among the students of liturgiology. In India too, it is very significant that it was the liturgy used in India until the arrival of the Portuguese in 1498 AD and even up to the Synod of Diampa in 1599 AD. The purpose of the small book has been to focus our attention on this ancient liturgy used now by the members of the Church of the East, scattered all over the world. It is used in India, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Australia, America and Canada. It is still used in its original Aramaic, except in India where Malayalam translation is often used. This is the only church which uses the liturgy of the pre-Portuguese Syrian Christianity. This conclusion is sufficiently supported by the decrees of the Synod of Diampa of AD 1599. The liturgy of Addai and Mari is used unaltered in the Chaldean Syriac Church today, and it is a liturgy which Archbishop Alexio de Menezes deemed it necessary for correction. The liturgy of St. James, used by the Orthodox Syrian Church, Independent Syrian Church of Thaddeus, the Thoma Syrian Church and Syrio-Malankaraite, in one way or the other, can trace back its existence in India only to AD 1665. Any claim to its previous presence in India made by Ian Philip is not supported by any historical evidence. The Chaldean Syrian churches claim to be a faithful remnant of the pre-Portuguese Syrian Christianity, and Kerala is strengthened by the Church's observance of this ancient liturgy without correction or revision. The only other church in India which uses this liturgy, although mutilated, is the Syro-Malabar Rite, which is trying now to restore the original characteristics of this liturgy. Since that liturgy has been Latinized for centuries, it is difficult to recapture the true spirit of the liturgy of Addai and Mari. Moreover, the Syro-Malabar version of this ancient liturgy has been abbreviated so that it can be celebrated within 40 minutes. This liturgy, the liturgy of the Addai and Mari, as it is celebrated in Chaldean Syrian churches, takes about 2 hours on Sundays and festival days. The objection often heard from the Syro-Malabarian against complete restoration is that it is not working or workable or advisable to have a long liturgy. It's not workable or advisable. To the question whether such a long liturgy is workable, today the answer of the present writer is, come and see it in the Chaldean Syrian Valia Pali. Works. Or it works, probably. Can't know sure that works because that fold in the centre here. The distinctive characteristics of the Addai and Mari liturgy has been the absence of the words of institution, but Father Paul Varghese states that the absence of the words of institution is not unusual in the Western Syrian tradition. Paul Varghese, and so forth. It must be emphasized that this liturgy used of the Chaldean Syrian Church is one of the earliest liturgies in the world. This adds to the ancient character of this church. The liturgy of Addai and Mari dates back to the period prior to the birth of Nestorius. This very fact strengthens the belief of this church that it is older than Nestorius. Therefore, it should not be described as a church founded by Nestorius. With regard to baptism and other sacraments, some sort of study has shown that the special characteristics of this church is the immersion of the infants. Because the churches which practice immersion baptism do not have infant baptism, and those who practice infant baptism perform it with sprinkling or pouring. Yes, got here Pentecostalists, Baptists, etc., Methodists, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and Anglicans, etc. Okay. Here it talks about piety. And the church is unique in certain respects. In regard to fasting and abstinence, this church has stricter. In regard to fasting and abstinence, this church has stricter rules similar to most of the Orthodox churches, but in practice, unlike the Metropolitan group of the Chaldean Syrian Church, most of the Orthodox churches have relaxed the rigour of abstinence. For example, during the days of abstinence, the restriction regarding fish, milk and butter is relaxed in the Orthodox Syrian Church. In India, they continue to abstain from meat and eggs. This relaxation has been seen in the patriarchal group of the Chaldean Syrian Church since AD 1964. The majority group in the Chaldean Syrian Church, known as the Metropolitan group, however, continues to follow these ancient custom and practice. The lay people, however, often break these rules. Appendix 1, Outline of Baptism Service, or steps.